This evening we're going to hear a rather amazing story and a true one told by the person who lived it. Ruben Castaneda was born and raised in East Los Angeles. As a kid, he aspired to be a professional basketball player, but he didn't quite have the size or skill to be more than a bench player in high school. So he turned to journalism. After college, then Reuben joined the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner, where he covered earthquakes and gang shootings and a papal visit. I don't really know how all those relate, but that's what he did. And then he came to the Washington Post in late 1989, initially as a night police reporter. And that was a particularly tough period, as I'm sure many of you recall, when crack cocaine use and murders were spreading through a number of D.C. neighborhoods. And of course, Mayor Marion Barry was himself arrested on narcotics charges. Reuben covered many homicide scenes back then, and he got to know police on the street, detectives, gangsters, prostitutes. But he'd also had become himself a large consumer of crack, having been hooked on the drug during his final year working in Los Angeles. Thanks to a couple of compassionate editors at the Washington Post and the paper's willingness to pay for rehab, Reuben confronted his addiction in 1992 and got clean. And he ended up staying at the Post for more than 2 decades. Though he had his ups and downs there on stories. At one point, in fact, he found himself uncomfortably in the center of a highly charged police controversy involving the inadvertent disclosure by him of something that had been said to him off the record. Reuben thought his future in journalism was going nowhere when he was taken off the D.C. police beat and sent to cover Prince George's County. But he dug into police misconduct there, exposing a series of abusive attacks by police dogs, which led to major reforms and helped resurrect Reuben's career. Now, in his first book, S Street Rising: Crack, Murder, and Redemption in D.C., Reuben tells not only his own remarkable story, but the larger narrative of D.C.'s drug epidemic. He movingly recounts other vivid tales, including a neighborhood pastor who was protected by a local drug leader, and the difficulties of an exceptional police homicide commander who ran afoul of D.C. politics. Reuben left the Washington Post about 3 years ago to edit a website that reports on Mexican drug cartels. But he still plays basketball. He plays pickup basketball every Saturday morning. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ruben Castaneda.
Thank you all for coming out. It's really nice to see a good crowd. Thank you for the nice, everybody in politics and prose has been great. It's true, I do still play pickup basketball every Saturday, but now 2 or 3 days later, my knees really hurt. And, so it's not exactly the same as it was. I took my first hit of crack in September 1988 when I was on a reporting assignment in a tough part of Los Angeles, where I was working for the LA Herald-Examiner. It was a few blocks west of the downtown area. By then, I was already drinking heavily, slipping pretty slowly into misery. I think I was pretty much on my way to becoming a garden variety drunk. But with that first hit of crack, I basically threw myself down a trapdoor toward hell. Didn't know it at the time. For a year or so, I used crack once or twice a week. I was able to rationalize to myself that I was under control because I usually wasn't using on days that I worked. I usually wasn't using during working hours. Of course, those usuallys always fade away the more that you go with any addiction. During my first year of using, uh, I initially started using just by myself. A young lady who spied me when I was out doing my reporting offered me a hit. I was 27. I was certainly old enough to know better, but young enough to think nothing would happen to me. I thought I could never become or was not an addict. So I took that hit, and I was hooked from the very first time I had that feeling. I kind of wobbled and managed to keep my feet, and the young lady who gave me the hit, asked me if I was okay, and I wanted to respond. I've never been so okay in my life. So initially, I started using by myself, but after a while, I started using with young women who traded sex for crack. They're known on the street as strawberries. It became part of my compulsion. There was also an element of calculation to this, in that I didn't want to make the crack buys directly myself. I didn't want to expose myself to an arrest by the police. I didn't want to put myself in that kind of risk. So I insulated myself by having whichever girl I was with make the buy. When I got the job, I was hired by the Post in August of 1988 to work as a nighttime police reporter. This was not quite at the height of the violence behind the crack epidemic, but it was getting there. There were bodies dropping just about every night. There was violence in dozens of DC neighborhoods in the eastern half of the city. And the Post needed somebody, because they were down a reporter, and they needed somebody fast. So I came out for a series of interviews in one day, flew back the next day. The day after that, I was offered the job. There was no drug test, so I drove east to D.C. in September 1989. This was just a few days after President George H.W. Bush, the first, Poppy Bush, had delivered that speech in the Oval Office, where he had this big package of crack cocaine that he said had been taken off a drug dealer at Lafayette Park. And he kind of poked at it awkwardly and said, this was the scourge that was ruining D.C. and the rest of the country. And it was. At that time, things have changed a lot, but at that time, the crack, the violence behind crack was probably the number one national story. It was no accident that he used the phrase "war on drugs," because the violence was taking a tremendous toll in Los Angeles, New York, certainly D.C. So I drove to D.C. for this new job, thinking this is a fresh start, it's a new life, it's another chance. And I vowed that I was leaving all of that behind. I wasn't going to use crack. I could still drink, I figured, but I was done with drugs. And that lasted exactly 4 days. I got into town on a Tuesday, and by Saturday afternoon, I got drunk while watching some college football games on TV, and I decided I'd just go out and check out my new city. Something that I'd done many times in Los Angeles, driving while drunk. Somehow I'd managed to never get in an accident, never get a citation, never get pulled over by police. I was extraordinarily lucky. I had gone maybe 3 blocks when I saw this young lady standing on a corner on 13th Street Northwest near Thomas Circle. And looking back, I think I just knew. I think it was just sort of junkie intuition. I just knew that she was a crack user and that she was a strawberry. I let her into my car, and I asked her if she partied, which people on the street would know what that means. She didn't even answer me verbally. She just opened up this little change purse that she had, and she showed me a crack pipe and a lighter. So yeah, she partied. She directed me. She didn't have any crack on her, but she directed me a few blocks. I think it's east to S Street Northwest, the 600 block of S Street, which if you go by there today, it's this just really nice block that has old, well-maintained row houses, a couple of gleaming new buildings on the corner of 7th and S, um, and this, kind of stately Victorian row house that serves as New Community Church right in the middle of the block. But at that time, it was far different. When I turned onto the block, there were about a dozen drug dealers on one side of the block in front of this abandoned Hostess Bakery, an equal number on the other side. This was a sunny September afternoon, and they ruled the street. They weren't worried about police or anybody else seeing them. So I let the young lady out of the car, gave her the money, let her out of the car. She got out. All the drug dealers knew her. They ran right to her, surrounded her, and she just took her time, sort of like looking what each of them was offering. She made her choice, made the buy. The money and the crack exchanged hands. She came back into my car, and we drove to my apartment. I said something on the way like, "I guess these guys haven't heard about the war on drugs," and she just gave me kind of a puzzled look. By the summer of 1991, I was spiraling out of control. The frequency and the amount that I smoked was increasing exponentially. I was becoming increasingly unpredictable. There was one night where, I think this was early October of that year, where I got a big check from the Post. Well, big for me and certainly big for 1991. It was north of $700. And this was for what they called comp time. Whenever you work extra hours in a quarter, you had the choice of taking vacation time or getting paid for it. And I always went for the money because I always needed it. So I had this money and I had the best intentions. I thought I'd go home, get some rest, go to the bank the next day, deposit it. But on my way, I ran into this young lady, Champagne, the girl that I'd met on 13th Street. And, I thought, well, one or two hits of crack wouldn't hurt. By dawn the next morning, all of that money was gone. And I had started to take money out of my bank account. So even at that point, I still didn't admit to myself that I was an addict. I knew I had a problem, but I always had this feeling that if I could just string one or two weekends together where I didn't do anything, I'd be okay. And I did things. I tried to stop myself. I went into the bank and insisted on signing a document that would limit the amount of money that I could withdraw on any given day in any 24-hour period. At times I tore up my ATM card. I tried to work it so that I had just enough money to get through the weekend to get food and gas if I needed it. But I always found ways to defeat myself. I would start borrowing money from coworkers and friends, fellow basketball players from the Y. And when I ran through them, I start calling people on the West Coast, friends and family, with some lame story about having lost my wallet and asking for them to wire me money. And they always did, because, what are you going to do? They had no idea, at least at first, of the problems that I was going through. It all came to a head for me a few days before Christmas, 1991. I walked in one night for my work shift. I was more disheveled than I am now. Unshaven, my eyes were bloodshot. I think I had a sheen of perspiration, and it was cold. I was in no shape to work. And reason being, I'd gone out on a binge that afternoon before my work shift. That was part of the spiral. I was no longer just using on my nights off. I was using when I had to work, and I was just increasingly unpredictable. So my editor, Phil Dixon, said, just go home, don't worry about it, come back the next night. So I went home, I worried about it a lot, and I came back the next night, and the Metro editor at the time, Milton Coleman, the man who hired me, told me to follow him upstairs. I followed him. We went and talked to an EAP counselor, Employee Assistance Program counselor, who the Post had hooked me up with about a month earlier. Someone had at the paper, I think it was a news aide, had noticed that something was amiss with me, and had reported it to an editor. And Phil and Milton had talked to me, not in a confrontational way. I mean, they said they wanted to help me, and they put me in touch with this EAP counselor, who I was meeting, I think, on a weekly basis. And I really tried. I mean, I tried, but I was one of these people who just, I wasn't going to get clean unless I was taken off the street. So when Milton took me upstairs to meet with this counselor, they surprised me. They said, "We've made arrangements for you to spend the next 3 weeks at Suburban Hospital at the rehab unit." And they said, "Well, you don't have to go." And I looked at Milton, and I actually tried to bargain him down to an outpatient program, maybe. I was scared at the idea that someone in authority was telling me I was at such risk that I had to be taken off the street, that I could not be trusted to be on my own. But they were right. So Milton, we loaded me up into his black, I think it was a Toyota SUV, stopped at my apartment to get a few things like a toothbrush, change of clothes, and then drove me, I think it was either down Connecticut or Wisconsin, to go to Suburban Hospital. And he stayed with me until I signed in. And I remember he left quickly, and I thought it looked like he couldn't wait to get out of there. And I have to say, I can't blame him if that's how he felt, because I didn't think there was any chance that this was going to work. I got out 3 weeks later. By then, I sort of felt like I kind of got the hang of what I needed to do. Another good friend from the Post, Cortland Malloy, picked me up, took me to a support group meeting, and I was just, on fire doing all the right things. And then about 77 days into this, in early March, I ran into one of my contacts who offered me a hit of crack, and it was like, okay. It was like a switch went off. So we went to my apartment, and she had exactly one rock. She let me smoke half of it. And I knew I was in big trouble before I even exhaled. I just knew it, because I wasn't the same addict I was when I went into rehab. It was far worse. I mean, every cell of my body just screamed for more and more crack. Something that they teach you in rehab is that an addict who stops using and resumes doesn't pick up where they left off, but in a much worse place, because the addiction keeps growing inside you. I didn't know what to make of it when they said that, but I certainly knew what they meant as soon as I took that hit. I call it the monster. It's like this monster that's growing inside and getting just stronger and stronger and stronger. With each day that I'm getting better, each day that I don't use, the monster still in me getting worse and worse. I went out to try to find more crack cocaine on S Street, and this was March of 1992, so it was still a very active drug market. Couldn't find anybody selling. Went to a secondary drug market on 1st and T Northwest. Couldn't find anybody selling. To this day, I think it was kind of a minor miracle. Went home, got a couple of hours of fitful sleep, and woke up the next morning very unsure of myself. I could have gone either way. I didn't have a plan. I wandered down the street, and I ran into the neighborhood heroin addict, whose name was Roxanne. And I guess she saw that I was distressed, because she just asked me what was wrong. And I just sat down and just kind of blurted out everything that had happened to me the last few months. And this was a real turning point. She said she knew exactly what I was going through, and she told me what I needed to do. She said, just start over, go to a support group meeting, raise your hand, start over. And she was a heroin addict who also used crack. So she could have easily taken advantage and said, well, what we need to do is party. And she could have led me in any of a half dozen different directions to make buys. She really could have. And I would have, like that, gone. And I don't know that I would have made it out, because at that point I did have a little money in my pocket. I'm not sure I would have even made it out alive. So I started over. And I've been good with that, with alcohol and drugs since then. Fast forward a little, in 2007, I had a conversation with an editor named Tracy Reeves. I don't know if she's here. She was an editor at the Washington Post Prince George's Bureau, where I was working at the time. And we just started talking about our lives. And I told her the broad outlines of my story. So her eyes got big, and she said, "You got to write that." And I was unsure, because like that's a pretty big risk to write about this kind of experience. But she kept, she was insistent. She said, "This is a great story. You have to write it." And she suggested going to the Post magazine. And I thought about it for a few months, and eventually I ran into Sidney Trent, a Washington Post editor at the downtown office. We looked at each other, and we both said, "We got to talk." I went into her office. I told her my story, and she said, "Okay, write it." I wrote it, and it was published in December of 2007. And that eventually led to this book, S Street Rising. I'm going to read a couple of passages. Before that, I want to make a couple of points, though. I felt like I didn't want to write what's known as addiction porn, which is just, nonstop scene after scene after scene of the worst kind of debasement. I'm also incapable, I couldn't write a fairy tale either. What I wanted to do was write something that showed my story, but also the larger story of what was going on in the city and what was going on S Street, because I thought they were all interconnected, and they're all amazing stories. So I look at this as my story being the engine, but it's not the entire vehicle. It's also the story of Pastor Jim Dickerson, a remarkable minister who launched a church on S Street in the middle of a combat zone, and who managed to not only survive but thrive with his ministry because he forged this alliance with the drug dealer who ran the block for decades, who was named Baldy, who's a character in the book. And it's also the story of an exceptional police commander named Lou Hennessy, Judge Hennessy now, whose police career was derailed when he tried to investigate a murder that may have been committed by one of Marion Barry's cronies, Barry was mayor at the time. And I think it's also a story of the city at large, too. I think this is very much about the city during the crack era and beyond. So I don't think that it's like a conventional memoir. It's far more than just my story. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple different passages that show different aspects of this. The first one is from the first chapter, and this is about the first time I tried crack cocaine. I was working on a story that related to immigration for the LA Herald Examiner, so I figured a good area to go would be this area just west of downtown, where there were a lot of Central American immigrants. And here's where I pick up. It was a tough area, perfect for my mission. Central American gangsters controlled the streets, the parks, the alleys. Some blocks belonged to the gang known as Mara Salvatrucha, or MS-13. Others were ruled by the 18th Street Gang. In their wife beaters and jeans, gangbangers openly peddled marijuana, heroin, and crack. At some intersections, the slingers covered every corner, keeping a sharp eye out for LAPD black and whites, or anyone who looked like he didn't belong. Buttonholing strangers for interviews wouldn't work in a full-on crack zone. The street dealers might figure me for a cop. Maybe they'd leave. Maybe they'd make me leave. I needed a quiet street. A mile or so west of downtown, I hung a right and took inventory. A cheap little motel, a couple of apartment buildings, some single-family homes. No slingers in sight. With my notebook and pen tucked into my back pocket, I hopped out of my car and wandered up the street looking for someone to interview. The girl quickly caught my eye. She was standing under a little awning in front of the motel. Apparently in her early 20s, she had fair skin, jet black shoulder-length hair, and a beauty pageant-worthy body clothed in cutoffs and a tank top. She looked like a rising starlet, someone you'd see in a cheesy sitcom or a shampoo commercial. She busted me checking her out and threw me a quick smile. I smiled back. She waved me over. The interviews could wait. "Hi," she said. "Haven't seen you around here before." "I don't live around here. I'm on a work assignment. What's your name?" Raven, how about you? Reuben. So, Reuben, do you work all the time? What do you mean? Raven twirled her fingers through her hair. Do you party? Why are you asking? Was she flirting? Was I that lucky? Raven took something out of her back pocket. She opened her hand, displaying a small plastic baggie. It contained a white, square-shaped chunk about the size of an M&M. Got some rock, she said. Give you a hit, no charge. Crack was raging through the poorest sections of the city. Though it was relatively new to L.A., the drug was already taking on a mythic quality. Doctors warned that even one hit could hook someone hopelessly and forever. Time stopped. I knew the little chunk in Raven's hand was dangerous. I pictured the junkies I'd seen during reporting forays to Skid Row. Homeless, desperate men who crawled on the pavement, searching for stray bits of crack. Dead-eyed women who worked the streets, offering their bodies so they could score another hit. I'm not lying, Raven said. First one's free. You won't find a better deal. I pushed the images of the desperate addicts out of my mind. No way I'd become one of them. I'd smoked pot 4 times and had never gotten very high. I'd smoked PCP twice. I'd hallucinated for a couple of days, but quickly returned to my normal routine. If I could avoid becoming hooked on pot and PCP, what harm could there be? Shadows were creeping onto the street. Late afternoon was giving way to twilight, my favorite part of the day. It signaled the end of the workday, a time to relax, maybe hit Corky's, the neighborhood dive bar for the Herald Examiner, with some Herald Examiner pals, though any time after noon worked for me, and I didn't need any company to knock back a few drinks. I was 27, old enough to know better, young enough to feel invincible. A few hours earlier, I'd gone to Corky's and downed 2 gin and tonics with my lunch. The lingering buzz from my lunchtime drunks had made me stupid cocky. Sure, I said. Raven reached into her pocket and pulled out a glass pipe. Its filter was blackened from repeated use. She reached into her pocket again and brought out a lighter, then removed the rock from the baggie and cut it in half with her fingernail. She loaded it onto the filter and tapped it until it was secure, then brought the pipe to her lips, flicked on the lighter, and put the flame to the pipe. The rock hissed softly as it dissolved. She inhaled. Thick white smoke coursed through the pipe and into her mouth. She held her breath for about 5 seconds before exhaling a puff of white smoke, handing me the pipe and nodding. I glanced over my shoulder. The street was dead quiet. Olympic Boulevard might as well have been 40 miles away. With darkness encroaching, passing motorists would have needed superhumanly sharp eyes to see what we were doing. I put the pipe to my lips. Raven flicked on the lighter and put the flame to the tip of the pipe. No backing out now. I inhaled. Smoke invaded my mouth and lungs. The rush hit me almost instantaneously. Euphoria detonated in my brain and spreading quickly to every part of my body. I wobbled and took a step backwards. You okay, Raven said. I looked into her big brown eyes. Wow. So that was my first experience with crack cocaine. I didn't think that it would lead to anything. I thought, okay, I'll try this a couple times and then just sort of go on with my life. I'm going to read a section here from chapter 3, which introduces the S Street and the church storyline. S Street was where I would make most of my buys when I moved to Washington, D.C. And a few years ago, I think it was the fall of 2008, I wandered back to the street because I was curious, what was it like for the people who lived there? What was it like for this church during that time? And I knocked on the door, and I talked to a church caretaker named Billy Hart, who's close friends with Pastor Jim. And he said, oh, yeah, we were okay because we were protected by Baldy, like I'd know. And okay, who's Baldy? And Baldy was the drug dealer who ran the block. And I tried not to let my eyes bug out of my face because I thought, wow, this is a story. Eventually, I talked to Pastor Jim, and we went through a series of interviews, and I got this, I think, really compelling story of the church and how it survived on this block. On a gray, frigid day, Pastor Jim Dickerson and demolition man Claude Artis inspected a small wood frame house on S Street Northwest. The structure stood a few feet from a 4-story Victorian that Jim and his humble congregation, a dozen strong, hoped would become their spiritual home, the place they would gather for Sunday services. It was January 1984. Cops had shooed away the heroin junkies, squatters, hookers, and hustlers who'd made the big brick house at 614S their own for years. The building would need to be thoroughly cleaned and renovated before it would be of any use as a church. But first, Jim and Claude had to deal with the smaller house, which was also part of the property, and looked as if it might fall over in the first decent breeze. Jim and Claude crunched their boots over the remnants of a recent snowfall as they circled the sad little building. The front door and windows were long gone. The framing was rotting. The roof looked like two big slabs of Swiss cheese. 15 or so drug dealers were working the other side of the street, near the not yet derelict Hostess Bakery. Delivery trucks lurched out of the huge building every 15 minutes or so. The inviting smell of freshly baked bread, muffins, and cakes filled the winter air. A couple of the slingers wandered over to a fire burning inside a rusty metal trash can on an empty lot directly across the street from the old wooden house. The drug dealers eyeballed Jim, Claude, and the demolition man's crew. Claude hired laborers off the street. Some bought drugs from the drug dealers. Claude studied the house. He was compact and muscular, with a thick neck and arms and shoulders that could have belonged to a middleweight boxer. Claude looked like someone who could handle himself in a brawl. "This bad boy's done," he said. "It can't be saved. I best blow it up." Jim nodded in agreement. "I'm afraid you're right. This structure's not worth saving. We're better off knocking it down." A tall and lean 40-year-old, Jim wore wire-rimmed glasses and a beard. He was bald on top, with a fringe of brown hair that ran from ear to ear. He looked like he'd be at home in a college lecture hall. The slingers who gathered near the fire leaned toward one another and exchanged whispers. They threw hard looks at Jim and Claude. Silently, Jim and Claude came to the same unnerving conclusion. The dope boys were using this little house to hide their stashes of heroin, methamphetamine, and Dilaudid. Now here they were, fixing to blow it up. Jim rubbed the back of his neck. This was grief he didn't need. The minister looked at Claude. The two men were good friends. Jim asked Claude what they should do. The demo man pivoted toward the dope boys and said, "Come with me, Reverend." Halfway across the street, Claude, in his deep, booming voice, called out, "Listen up, fellas. Reverend wants to talk with you." Claude had caught Jim by surprise. Jim could usually yap about anything until the seasons changed, and he'd planned on reaching out to the street dealers soon, but not this soon. He felt his pulse quickened as they approached the slingers. Jim and Claude stopped on one side of the trash can. The dealers gathered on the other side, about 5 feet away, and stared hard at Jim, murder in their eyes. The pastor shifted toward Claude until they were standing shoulder to shoulder. He was scared, shaking, which he hoped the dope boys would mistake for shivering from the cold. "Help me, God," Jim prayed to himself as he scanned the audience. In the next moment, the words came to him. "Listen, fellas, we're going to have to blow up that little house across the street," Jim said calmly. "So those of you who have your stash there, now's the time to get it out." The dealers looked at the house, then back at Jim. Jim felt his neck muscles tense. He wondered, what would he do? What could he do if the drug dealers bucked? What could he do if they declared war on him and his church? A slinger named Chief stepped up to Jim. Chief was an American Indian with a bronze complexion and a ponytail that hung to his waist. He never smiled. "Could really use your help again here, God," Jim prayed to himself. Chief extended his hand. "Well, thank you, Reverend. Thank you so much," Chief said. The drug dealer and the minister shook hands. Jim exhaled as a sense of relief and gratitude washed over him. Chief and the other slingers made a beeline for the doomed house. So that's sort of the early days of the church on S Street, where drug dealers ruled both sides of the street very openly. And Pastor Jim Dickerson, who never gave up on his ministry and also never gave up on trying to convince these drug dealers that they could change their lives, worked with them and reached out to them. Something I've heard him say many times is he tries to reach people not halfway, but reach them wherever they are. And he's not naive. He understands it's not always going to help. In fact, most often it won't. But he keeps trying, and that's why that ministry, why that church has survived and thrived on that block. So I'll read one more passage. This is from the third major thread of the book, which is what I call the DC Confidential thread, involving police corruption with the DC Police Department. To set this up a little, this scene involves Captain Lou Hennessy, who was the commander of the homicide unit, and was someone who was very important to me as the primary crime reporter for the Post, because we talked almost every day and sometimes several times a day, talking about murders, investigations. We developed a pretty good level of trust. This is now in September 1995. And where both of us believe at that point that our careers were on the rise. Lou had received, his squad had received an award, in fact, from the Justice Department for having a high closure rate. In mid-September, Lou received a strange phone call from a fellow white shirt he'd known for years. "I hear the mayor wants you out of homicide," the caller said. "What gives?" "News to me," Lou said. He figured it was just the police rumor mill working overtime. Why would Mary and Barry want him out? Lou and Barry didn't know each other and hadn't had any run-ins. Why mess with the one unit in the police department that was clearly succeeding? A few days later, in the underground parking garage at police headquarters, Lou ran into Ron Linton, chief of police reserves. Lou and Linton were friendly. Linton and Barry were tight. Lou buttonholed Linton and said, "I hear the mayor wants me out. Can you find out anything for me?" "Get out of here," Linton said. "Why would he want to bounce you?" "Probably doesn't," Lou replied, "but can you look into it?" 2 weeks later, Linton called Lou. He sounded perplexed. "You're right," Linton said. "The mayor wants you out. I don't know why." Lou wanted to know what was going on. Fred Thomas had retired as chief in July. Barry had named an assistant chief, Larry Soulsby, to step in as interim chief. Lou went to see Soulsby in his office. "Am I being transferred?" he asked. "No way," Soulsby said. "Everything's fine." Lou kept working cases. Lou wasn't known as the most honest guy in the department. The rank and file called him Lion Larry. But if Barry was going to make a move on him, Lou wondered, what could he do? Lou heard about the rumor shortly after I had returned from a fellowship at Duke in Washington. By early October, we'd both verified that the talk was true. Worse, Lou was being transferred to night patrol. It was a slap. Traditionally, homicide captains were promoted to the rank of inspector once they'd finished their time in charge of the squad. Lou had been arguably the most effective homicide commander in the department's history. He'd launched a bold and successful initiative under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. He turned things around. Homicide wasn't just holding its own, it was being lauded by the police, by the Justice Department. Still, the transfer was a done deal, sources told Lou and me. In late October, Barry called a press conference to announce that he was removing the interim from Soulsby's title. Soulsby would be the permanent chief. That meant he could appoint and transfer white shirts, police commanders. A couple of hours before the press conference, Lou was outside police headquarters walking to a deli to get lunch. His pager went off. Lou checked the number. It was an informant. Not just any source, a friend, an ex-cop Lou had known since his patrol days. Lou pulled out his cell phone and called back. "I need to see you right now," the informant said, his voice tense. They met outside a burger joint on New York Avenue, just east of downtown. Lou arrived first and waited by an outdoor table. His source roared up in a rental car. He had a gig returning other people's rentals. He didn't bother with niceties. "What's this I hear about you getting kicked out of homicide?" "It's true," Lou said. "Soulsby's announcing it today at a press conference. He's putting me on night patrol." "Do you want me to kill him for you?" Lou knew his informant was serious. He wasn't just running his mouth, and he was fully capable of hitting the chief. The source's street skills were legendary. In the early 80s, when the entire police force was looking for a cop killer, he'd put on street clothes and found the guy within 24 hours, then taken him down in a shootout. The cop was a hero for a minute, but he met a woman who liked heroin and coke. Internal Affairs got wind and busted him for supplying her with drugs. He went to trial and beat the charges, but the department fired him anyway. Up until then, Lou's friend didn't use. He loved the job. It gave him purpose. But without it, he fell down the rabbit hole. He started drinking, then using crack. He hung out at nightclubs and followed drug dealers home. The former cop would take them at gunpoint as they entered their apartments. He jacked their money, their drugs, or both. He did a couple of jolts in federal prison for cocaine possession. By the early 90s, he was back on the streets. Other cops turned their backs on him after he was fired. Lou never did. He even slipped him money now and then. Lou's friend was grateful. Through the years, he gave Lou enough good tips to close out 24 felonies, armed robberies, attempted murders, a handful of homicides. His information always panned out. Lou figured he was probably doing some dirt himself. His tips were too good. He was too close to the violence to not be part of it. Lou never pressed him, though. He didn't want to know. The source was one of the toughest men Lou had never known, and one of the most loyal enough to take out the chief or die trying. "No," Lou said, "listen to me. I don't want you to go anywhere near Soulsby. Don't try to kill him. Don't hurt him. Don't scare him. I don't want you to do anything. I'll handle this myself. Do you understand?" "Whatever you say," Lou's colleague said reluctantly. "But someone's got to do something about that motherfucker." Let me handle it, Lou pleaded. The informant nodded, then he got back in the rental and sped off. So I think that gives a sense of like the three major storylines, which are different, but they're really interconnected. And if you get to the end of the book, you'll see just how they're interconnected. So I think if anyone has questions. Anyone can ask questions. Yeah.
Could you step to the mic here so we can capture the question?
I'd like to know why, or could you share with us the reason your book has come out now? Is there any parallel between your book coming out and that of Marion Barry's?
Yeah, Barry and I planned this out. It's coming out now on my end because this was a really hard book to research and write, and it took me a long time. And I want to take this. There was no planning. It's just strictly a coincidence. I first learned that Barry even had a book in January when I read a short item in the Post. And I think this is a good opportunity for me to say that with a story this complex, with all these different storylines happening, in different points in time, I could not have gotten to this point where I actually finished without the help of two really amazing editors, Lee Beresford at Bloomsbury and Leonard Robert, who likes to remain in the background, but he's actually here today. So they're really just terrific editors. And originally, when I first signed the contract to do the book, the launch date, the pub date, would have been much earlier in time. I got an extension. That's the answer. Yes.
Yeah, a text like this requires an inner effort that most of the people who appear here don't go through. So it's admirable. But I did want to ask you, do you have any? We have about 310 or 315 million Americans. Do you have any idea of how many people or what percentages suffer from these addictions?
I used to know this like that when I was at the University of Rehab. I think that I've seen different estimates. I think it can go anywhere from, I think that the best estimates are maybe between 7 and 15%, which is a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And something that I learned in rehab, which really just stuck with me, has stuck with me forever. One of the counselors said that most people who have alcohol and addiction problems don't ever seek help. They don't ever seek to go into a program. They don't go into rehab. They don't try. And of those who do try, maybe 15% manage to stay clean on a long-term basis. So that really caught my attention. It's in the tens of millions, I think.
Small question. My name is Dolma, and I'm a Tibetan from India. So I congratulate with your book. Sounds interesting, but I just would like to know which one is this book. Is it your first time? If so, I understand. I don't know whether I'll be able to afford to buy it, but we would like to some kind of, since you had the journalistic opportunity, and I'm also one of them, or one of you guys, I would like to hear something that's that you were able to contribute to the DC, because it looks like it has been victimized and what do we call, like exploited by many of you guys. And I really like the way you talk, very Hugh Hefnerish, and I don't know whether you're one of the network, of those origins. Any positive note that we could carry out, when I travel, back to India where I'm from, and things like that, and especially to the Latin countries, who are very poor, but only very few, keep sucking.
Well, I think there's some positive ideas that are in the book. I mean, certainly the title itself suggests a transformation for the better, which S Street certainly has experienced, and I think the city as a whole has experienced. there's downsides to that with gentrification because people sometimes are squeezed out of their homes because of rising rents or property taxes. But I would say that there's plenty of positive that you can get from the entirety of the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been in D.C. since '79, and I remember the crack epidemic and the accompanying crime rate that went up. I'm wondering, why do you think it started, not just here? Why did it die down? Was crack treated differently than cocaine, which was, my understanding, similar, but was for white users, and crack was used more by black users? And also, what do you think about drugs being legal? I think the drug war is only succeeding in jailing a third of young black men. It should be treated, in my mind, as a health problem, not as a crime. I'm a lawyer. I have not a criminal lawyer. I have a client who turned himself in the government that he was using cocaine, and they fired him and they investigated him criminally. So that's what happens when you try to deal with it openly sommes.
Boy, there's a lot of questions there.
But they were succinct.
I'll try a couple of the main ones. This is a good chance to recognize the Post itself for at the time I went through this experience, treating alcoholism and addiction, substance abuse as a health issue. Their attitude when they found out I was in trouble was to help me. That was the policy, and I think it still is, which I think is extraordinarily positive and progressive. So I don't think Milton Coleman is here, at least not yet. I think he was going to try to get here. He probably saved my life by taking me there to rehab when he did. As for how crack cocaine started, a lot of money to be made. How did it get here? There was a book that was written by a reporter named Gary Webb, who turned a series of articles he wrote for the San Jose Mercury News into a book. I think that suggested that there, CIA connections might have helped pump drugs and possibly crack into LA and other cities.
You think that's true?
It's hard to say. I mean, there was a Senate investigation headed by John Kerry, and those findings are public. I think it's impossible to just point to one specific cause, but at some point, somebody put powder cocaine together with baking soda and created this thing called crack, and it's extraordinarily addictive, and you can buy it. The basic unit is $20, so it seems really accessible to people who don't have a lot of money. And the first couple are $20, great high. Problem is, it's so addictive, you keep going back and back and back and back and back. And yes, you're right that the laws that were passed, I think in the 80s and maybe in the 90s too, created harsher penalties for possession and distribution of crack versus powder cocaine. And I think the administration is trying to do some things and has done some things to mitigate that now.
What about legalization of drugs? You can't
I
dodge
don't think
it.
I should talk about that.
Take the fifth. Huh?
It's a conflict. I'll take the fifth on that
Okay,
one.
thank you very much. Fascinating story.
Were there any attributes that you developed as an addict that you think made you a more effective journalist, or any attributes as a journalist that made you predisposed towards addiction?
Yeah, the latter more. Well, I think I had certain attributes that helped as a journalist. Kind of like once I make my mind up about something, I can be kind of relentless about it, and that can be good if it's channeled in a positive direction. Not so good if it's channeled in a negative direction. I think I clearly have a compulsive streak, much less so today than then. But I think I need to, I think I'm good if I can focus on things that are positive. But really, I think I was simply born an alcoholic and an addict. The first time I had a drink of alcohol in high school at a party, I just wanted more. I mean, I liked the way it made me feel, and I didn't want to drink slowly and just savor it. I just wanted more like that. And I didn't have any event that caused me to try to self-medicate. I had a normal upbringing. I didn't, we weren't wealthy, but we didn't want for anything. So I think I was simply born that way. That said, it's my responsibility to stay away from that.
Thanks.
Hi, Reuben.
Hi, Wendy.
As your former colleague at the Washington Post who also covered cops, I want to ask a question about race. And I would like to ask about the role race played in the writing of the book, if any, and how you, as a Latino male, experienced race in your experiences within the newsroom itself at the Washington Post.
Well, let's try the first one first. Race in writing the book. Well, clearly there's, race plays a part in every aspect of life in D.C. It's in one of the early pages of the book. There's this thing known as the plan, which many people who live in the city believe. I think I was in the city, 5 minutes and I heard about it. And the plan is this idea that at some point, that the whites in D.C. were going to take over the reins of city government, just sort of take it over. At the time that I heard about it, Barry was the mayor, so he would have had to get pushed aside. But as I understood it, the plan simply meant whites take over city government, no matter what the black population is. And when I first got here in 1989, it was a strong majority black population. As for what was it?
The role race played in your experiences within the Washington Post newsroom itself.
Yeah, that's hard to say. You read the book. I got along better with some editors than others. I thought some editors treated me more fairly than others. Whether it had to do with me being Latino, I have no idea. It could have simply been personality clashes. I'm the first one to say I was not very good at office politics. I was really good at getting along with people who I liked and respected, and not so good if that wasn't there. And I think there were times where I could have handled situations better, and I think there were times where the managers who I worked for could have handled situations better. So I honestly don't know whether my Latino background had anything to do with the conflicts I experienced at the paper. I really don't know. That's honest. Hey.
Hey, how you doing, Ruben? My question is, what was your initial impression of Reverend Dickerson, and what were your expectations? Did he exceed your expectations, or did you think that he was gonna, kind of flame out?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, initially, I met Pastor Jim Dickerson over the phone. Billy Hart handed me the phone where he was talking with Pastor Jim and said, there's this guy here who wants to, do a story. And initially, Pastor Jim was, I think, very wary. He sounded like he wasn't too trusting of journalists. And, I thought there was probably a reason for that. Not all journalists are created equal, and maybe he'd had a bad experience. So, but he seemed like somewhat open-minded and willing to talk to me about how he'd established the church and his alliance with Baldy, the drug dealer. But things really changed. For my own reasons, I didn't contact him for a few months. I just was, I had to work out for myself what it would mean to try to explore how this church became established on this street where I had helped create the chaos by making so many drug buys. I had to work out some of my own feelings about my culpability. But eventually, right around the 1st of January of 2009, I did call Pastor Jim. And I asked him if he'd read the magazine article I'd written for the Post about how I'd been a crack addict and while covering the crime beat. And he hadn't. So I made a copy for him. I felt it was fair for him to know that, because I thought he may not react well to this. I didn't help things on his street. So I made a copy for him, and I left it for him at the church. And the next time we talked, he was completely different. He was relaxed, he was open, and he said something to the effect of, Knowing that you've been through that gives you more credibility with us. Everybody's in recovery from something. And then we took it from there, and we would meet weekly. And I have to say, I'll be forever grateful for his generosity in being so open to talk about how he established the church and how he worked with Baldy and the other drug dealers.
Ruben, we have time for just a couple more questions.
Okay.
Hi, so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of a newspaper in the kind of politics and functions of a city, and if you think that role has changed at all with kind of the decline of print journalism.
Well, the role of the paper used to be a really important one. When I got here, certainly like the Post was a really, it was a power in the city. What it covered, what it chose to editorialize about really mattered. And it still does. But over time, with all of the hits that the industry has taken, certainly economically, I think the influence has lessened dramatically, and the biggest hit has been to local reporting. There's just not nearly the amount of in-depth local reporting that you once saw, and I don't think it's coming back. There was a Columbia Journalism Review article out a week or two ago that described what the Post is like now under its new owner, and very clearly they have global aspirations, and that means that something's got to give, and that means there's less emphasis on local reporting. Tim?
We'll take that one and then this one, and then we're out of time.
First of all, I just wanted to say I think I've read basically everything you've ever written, Reuben, for the Post, and I'm pretty awe of your coverage, particularly in Prince George's County. And I was kind of surprised, especially that the canine police stuff that you did was amazing. I can still remember reading that from the front page, and it was a great story. But I wanted to get your reaction. The Post, I felt, in some ways, didn't utilize your institutional knowledge on a particular major story that happened, and they won a lot of awards for it. I just wonder if you could tell us what's your thoughts on why you weren't used. Was your addiction have anything to do with this, or I mean, you weren't addicted at the time, or I mean, so could you explain like?
Well, there was I think you mean there was a series on like police brutality that the Post did that.
Shootings and so forth, yes.
Yeah, at a certain point after I'd written a lot about police dog attacks and other forms of police misconduct, the Post launched this big series that I was not, with a team of reporters that I was not a part of. I wasn't even told about it. I learned about it like by accident. I don't know why. I don't think it had anything to do with addiction. I mean, I hadn't been using at that point for many years. I'm not sure that the editor in charge at the time even knew of that I'd been to rehab. I mean, do I think I should have been part of that team? Yeah, but I wasn't, and that conflict is a big part of one of the chapters in the book.
Ruben, last question.
Okay. Hi, and congratulations. Just as a preface to my question, did you ever see that Ted Koppel town meeting show in Anacostia that went till 4 o'clock in the morning when ABC gave him the right to extend it? It was on drugs and it went into race. It was in about 87 or 86.
Oh gosh.
I don't know. Somebody may have seen that. It was.
I don't think I
worth
did.
looking up, and that just leads into my question: will you be reading in some of the areas that still have a lot of the fallout from the communities that were generationally affected by?
Sure, I'll read there if invited. Yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to know. Thank you very much.
You have to ask this question.
Do you think the motivation for writing this book was at all to celebrate or cement your conquest of your addiction? Do those, sort of personal
I
drivers
love that
have
question because this gives me the opportunity to say this. I have not conquested. I've not beaten anything. This is not a conquest. I am an addict. If I were to start using today, my next stop would be the morgue if I'm lucky. I wouldn't want to live through what would happen next if I'd rather die, because the addiction has gotten worse over time. Now, I think I'm in a good place. Day by day, I don't use, and I don't think about it. I'm one of the lucky ones. So to answer your question, I thought I had like a really compelling story. Not just me though, me and what happened with the police department, what happened with the city, and what happened on S Street. And I thought I had this really compelling perch, you know, as a crime reporter, as somebody who bought drugs on the street, as somebody who put himself in dangerous situations many times. I thought I had like this really amazing perch from which to tell the story. So no, it wasn't about taking a victory lap or anything, no.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.